Tonight we have 3 disturbing Skinwalker stories. First, a woman rots into her couch for 12 years, fused by a Skinwalker curse while her family watches in silence. Next, a pilot is lured to his death at 4,000 feet by a mimic stealing his dead wife's voice. Finally, a rancher finds a coyote standing in his pen, mocking him with a sickeningly perfect moo. You're gonna want to watch until the very end, because when the rancher puts a bullet right in its chest, the way that monster responds is absolutely terrifying. When police entered the home, they found 36-year-old Maya dead and fused 8 inches deep into the leather couch, with her parents sitting 2 feet away. She spent 12 years on that sofa, rotting until her skin bonded with the leather, while her parents sat beside her every day to eat and watch TV. The air in that living room was stagnant, a solid wall of stench that hit you the moment the door opened. It tasted sweet, like overripe fruit left in the sun, mixed with the sharp burning sting of ammonia that made your eyes water instantly. Beneath the sofa, the floorboards were buckling, soaked through by a decade of biohazard waste that had seeped from the ruined cushions. Maya's grandmother, Elsie, stood at the edge of the room, her hands tucked deep into her pockets to hide their shaking. She was a woman who lived by the old ways, a traditionalist who knew that what the police were seeing wasn't just a case of extreme neglect. She had visited this house several times a week for years. Every time she had stayed silent, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that in the presence of a predator, the loudest sound you can make is a plea for help. What the police report called neglect, Elsie knew by a different, older name. In the lore of the desert, there is a specific type of darkness that doesn't just kill you, it consumes you while you are still breathing. To understand why Maya didn't move for 12 years, you have to understand the nature of the Yi-Nald-Lushi, the Skinwalker. We often think of these entities as monsters that hunt in the woods, but the most dangerous ones don't hunt in the wild. They come inside, they marry into families, they become stepfathers, they sit at the dinner table, and they feed. The curse that held Maya to that couch wasn't paralysis. It was a slow-motion rot of the soul that eventually turned physical. It starts with the mind. The victim feels a distinct sluggishness, as if their blood has turned into cold syrup. Then, the skin begins to weep. It becomes sticky, porous. The barrier between the person and the object they sit on begins to dissolve. It is a biological fusion. The Skinwalker uses the victim like a living battery. As the victim rots, releasing the energy of their suffering, the witch absorbs it to extend their own life. It is a parasitic bond. To the outside world, it looks like a tragedy of mental illness. But to those who know the signs, like Elsie, it is a 12-year ritual of consumption. Elsie's eyes drifted to Marcus, Maya's stepfather. He stood by the kitchen door, a tall, unsettling silhouette against the yellowed wallpaper. Marcus had a terrible, dragging limp. Every time he shifted his weight, it sounded like dry leather scraping against stone, a rhythmic scritch, slide, scritch that grated on the nerves. He never blinked. Even now, as the blue and red police lights pulsed through the dusty windows, his eyes remained wide and glassy, reflecting the light like a coyote caught in the high beams. He always carried the scent of the deep desert, the smell of old, sun-dried animal hide and stagnant water. It was a smell that shouldn't exist inside a suburban living room, the scent of something dead that had been left out in the heat too long. To the officers, he was just a grieving stepfather claiming Maya had severe anxiety and simply refused to move. But Elsie knew the truth. Marcus was a human witch who had turned his stepdaughter into a living battery, slowly draining her life force to fuel his own dark longevity. She looked at Lulu, Maya's mother. Lulu sat in a daze, her eyes glued to the blank wall, her hands resting limply in her lap. Lulu loved her daughter, but her mind was clouded by the dark influence Marcus radiated. It was a hypnotic fog. For a decade, Lulu had eaten her dinner 2 feet away from her rotting daughter, unable to smell the stench, unable to hear her weak cries, because Marcus had pushed her mind into a deep, gray sleep. He had hollowed Lulu out to get to Maya. Elsie remembered her secret missions during those long, silent afternoon visits. While Lulu sat in her trance and Marcus watched TV, Elsie would wait for him to leave the room. The moment the kitchen door swung shut, she would lean over the sofa. With trembling fingers, she would gently move the tattered blankets, searching Maya's pale, stretched skin for a specific mark. She was looking for the puncture of a curse bolt, a tiny bead-like object shot into the flesh by a witch to initiate the dying process. If she could find it, she could use the sucker method, physically pulling the curse out of Maya's body with her own breath. Elsie had been ready to do it. She had been ready to pull the poison from her granddaughter's veins, but she never found a mark. The rot wasn't coming from a single wound. It was systemic. Marcus had been feeding Maya trace amounts of corpse powder for years. He had dusted it into her food, mixed it into her water. He had turned her very blood into a black sludge. The couch hadn't just caught her, it had absorbed her. The leather and the skin had become one single necrotic organism. Elsie realized then with a sinking horror that there was nothing to pull out. The corruption was total. The room fell into a sharp, brittle stillness, broken only by the wet, rhythmic slapping sound of the medical examiners trying to stabilize the remains. They wore hazmat suits, their breathing loud and amplified behind their masks. As they finally began to lift Maya's body, a sound like heavy canvas tearing filled the room, a dry, splintering noise. It was the sound of Maya's body finally separating from the upholstery. Inside the deep, dark hole left in the cushion, the movement began. Hundreds of maggots writhed in the cavity, pale and blind. They had been eating her from the inside out while she was still alive, a slow biological consumption overseen by Marcus for 12 long years. Elsie had spent those years hunting for Marcus's true human name. In the old stories, that was the only weapon. If you speak a skinwalker's true name to their face, the curse turns inward, and they wither within days. She had searched every drawer, flipped through every old book, and looked for any scrap of a birth certificate. But Marcus was meticulous. He had erased every footprint of his former life, leaving behind only the unblinking, leather-scented shell that now stood on the porch. As the police finally carried the heavy black bags out to the van, the sun began to dip below the horizon. The desert sky turned a bruised purple, and long, independent shadows stretched across the yard. Marcus stood on the porch, his dragging limp silent for once. He didn't look at the police. He didn't look at his wife, Lulu, who was being led to an ambulance. He looked directly at Elsie. A cold breeze kicked up, carrying that familiar scent of old hide and sage. In his eyes there was no grief, only a dark, patient hunger. Elsie felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched by something that has already decided where you fit into its plan. Marcus wasn't finished. He was already looking at Elsie, measuring her. With Maya gone, he needed a new battery to keep his hollow heart beating. Elsie walked to her car, her joints feeling stiff and locked, as if the very atmosphere of the house had begun to settle in her marrow. She knew the police would file their reports, and the news would talk about a tragedy of neglect. They wouldn't see the witch. they wouldn't see the curse. As she pulled away from the curb, she glanced in her rearview mirror. She saw Marcus standing perfectly still in the driveway. And for a split second, she realized with a jolt of pure terror that her own shadow seemed to linger on the pavement a second too long, as if it were trying to detach itself and run back to him. How many people do you pass every day who are carrying a name they've stolen, just waiting for the right person to help them hide it? Flight 402 vanished from radar over Shiprock, New Mexico at exactly 2 a.m. Search teams found the wreckage at the base of a 2,000-foot cliff, but the cockpit windshield was covered in fresh, muddy handprints on the outside. To understand why a veteran pilot drove a perfectly good aircraft into a wall of granite, you have to look at the investigation. You have to understand the people who show up when the fires go out. Agent Holliday worked for the National Transportation Safety Board. It's a government name that strikes fear into the heart of every mechanic and airline CEO. They are the detectives of the sky, an independent federal agency that doesn't answer to the airlines or the unions. They don't guess. They don't assume. They measure skid marks, analyze fuel composition, and reconstruct shattered metal to find the probable cause. Holliday led the GO team. That's the elite squad of technical experts dispatched within hours of a major accident. Her job was to apply logic to chaos. She dealt in facts, gravity, velocity, material stress. But Shiprock doesn't care about facts. Go back 12 hours. Chi was cruising at 4,000 feet above ground level. That meant he had nearly a mile of empty air between his wheels and the dirt. He was a hauler, a guy who spent more time in the air than in his own living room. The night was clear. Stars looked sharp enough to cut glass. Inside the Cessna, the heater kicked on, filling the small cabin with the smell of dust and burnt oil, the scent of a safe, boring shift. Engines worked hard against the altitude. It was a steady, mechanical rhythm that usually helped Chi relax. But as the jagged, volcanic silhouette of Shiprock rose up from the desert floor like a black tooth, the feeling in the cabin shifted. Pressure dropped. It felt like the air inside the plane turned into water, thick, stagnant, and impossible to breathe. That steady engine noise seemed to move away, becoming muffled and distant. Chi tapped his headset. He checked the dials. Oil pressure was green. Altimeter was steady. Farmington approach, this is Flight 402, Chi said, calling out to air traffic control. These are the eyes on the ground, the people in the dark rooms watching the radar blips to make sure planes don't occupy the same space at the same time. I'm losing audio. Do you read? Silence. It wasn't just a lack of talking. It was a vacuum. The background static, the reassuring noise of the open frequency, was gone. Then the connection opened. Chi, can you see me, honey? Chi froze. His hands locked on the yoke. It was Dahlia. His wife had been dead for 3 years. The cancer had taken her voice first, turning it into a painful rasp, and then it took the rest of her. But this wasn't the sick Dahlia. This was the voice from their honeymoon. Clear, sweet, alive. Dahlia, Chi whispered. Logic told him it was impossible, but grief is louder than logic. I see you, Chi, the voice said. It sounded intimate, like she was leaning over his shoulder in the empty cockpit. You look so tired, baby. Why don't you land? I'm right here. A strange sensation washed over him. It was a numbness, a narcotic peace that made his limbs feel loose. The alarm bells in his head stopped ringing. He looked out the windshield. The mountain was gone. The deadly 2,000-foot cliff face had vanished. In its place, a runway appeared in the sky. It was a glamour, a visual lie. 2 lines of brilliant pulsing lights stretched out into the darkness, suspended in the empty air. They shimmered with gold and violet, looking warm and inviting. "I've missed you so much," Chi wept. Something struck the side of the fuselage violently. It felt soft and wet, like a side of beef thrown against a wall. Then came the scratching. Chi didn't look left. If he had, he would have seen the shadow moving alongside the plane at 100 knots. He would have seen the creature loping through the air, defying aerodynamics. He would have smelled the sulfur and the rotting meat leaking through the vents. But he only saw the lights. "The runway is clear," the voice said. But the mask slipped, the sweetness cracked, revealing a sound underneath that ground like tectonic plates shifting. "Come down. Sleep now." Chi pushed the yoke forward. He didn't see the granite wall. He saw the way home. 3 days later, Agent Holliday stood in a sterile hospital room in Albuquerque. This was the part of the job she hated. The human part. She preferred the wreckage. Metal doesn't lie. Metal doesn't have nightmares. Chi lay in the bed, his body a roadmap of fractures and casts. He was awake, but his eyes were wide, scanning the corners of the room like a trapped animal. "Mr. Chi," Holliday said, opening her notebook. "I'm the investigator in charge. I need to ask you about the final moments of the flight. We recovered the flight data recorder. That box tells us the physics of the crash, your speed, your altitude, your control inputs. It shows you banked calmly into the terrain. No struggle." She didn't mention the other box, the cockpit voice recorder. That orange unit records the last 2 hours of audio from the headset microphones. She didn't mention that the audio technician had quit that morning after hearing what was on the tape. Chi licked his cracked lips. "The runway," he rasped. "Did you find the runway?" Holliday paused. She looked at him with the practiced patience of a federal agent who answers to the Federal Aviation Administration. The administration writes the rules, but Holliday's team cleans up the mess when they get broken. "There was no runway, Chi. You flew directly into the south face of Shiprock. You were miles from the nearest airfield." "No." Chi shook his head, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "The lights, gold and violet, and Dahlia. She talked me down. She guided me in." Holliday leaned forward. "We have to look at the facts. Hypoxia, oxygen deprivation at altitude. It causes hallucinations. You thought you heard your wife." "It wasn't hypoxia," Chi whispered. He gripped the bed rails with his good hand. "I heard her. And then I heard the other thing. The thing that sounded like grinding stones." He stopped. His gaze snapped to the open door of the hospital room. Holliday turned. A janitor was pushing a mop bucket slowly down the hallway. He was wearing gray coveralls that were a size too big, hanging off his lanky frame. He moved with a strange, loping gait, a slow, off-rhythm limp where his knee seemed to bend backward just a fraction too far with every step. "Him!" Chi hissed, pressing himself back into the pillows. "Ask him." "Ask who?" Holliday stood up. She looked at the empty doorway. The janitor had already passed. "The man with the walk," Chi said, his voice rising to a panic. "He was on the wing. He was on the glass. He followed me down." Holliday walked to the door. She looked down the corridor. It was empty. Just the wet sheen of mop water on the linoleum reflecting the fluorescent lights. "There's no one there, Chi," she said, turning back. "It's the medication. You need rest." Chi didn't answer. He was staring at the window. The blinds were closed, but on the other side of the glass, a shadow fell across the slats. A hand pressed against the outside of the window. It wasn't a human hand. The fingers were too long. Holiday didn't see it. She was busy writing pilot error spatial disorientation in her official report. She was doing her job, forcing the impossible into a box that made sense. She didn't hear the soft, grinding whisper that resonated through the glass, meant only for the man in the bed. "We are almost home," the voice said. There is a legend in the Four Corners region, older than the maps drawn by the government or the borders patrolled by rangers. The Navajo speak of the Yi Naldlushi, he who goes on all fours. We call them skinwalkers. These are not merely monsters. They are corrupted medicine men who have traded their humanity for the power to shift, to hunt, and to mimic. They are masters of the auditory hallucination. They steal the voices of your loved ones to lure you into the dark. They do not just kill, they feed on fear. They feed on the terror of the realization that the face you trust is wearing a mask of flesh. So, the next time you hear a familiar voice calling your name from the dark, or see a figure walking with a gait that seems just a little incorrect, do not answer. Do not look. Because if you acknowledge them, you have already invited them in. The rancher counted 30 heads of cattle, standing calmly in the pen from 20 yards away. He realized the animal in the center wasn't a calf, but a large coyote mooing perfectly, while the herd stood motionless around it. That realization didn't hit him all at once. It came slowly, like a truck struggling to turn over on a sub-zero morning. Freezing didn't do justice to the temperature that night. It was the kind of cold that stiffened the oil in your engine block and made plastic fittings snap if you looked at them wrong. Benny sat in his truck for a minute, just listening to the engine cool down. Metal contracted with sharp little snaps as the heat died away. He stepped out. Boots hitting the gravel sounded loud in the empty air. He wrapped his coat tighter. He wasn't out here to admire the view. He had a job to do. Check the perimeter, check the stock, get back inside before his fingers went numb. Walking to the perimeter fence, he grabbed the gate. Solid iron gets dangerous when it drops below zero. It felt slick, ready to peel the skin right off his palm if he held it too long. He let go and listened. Usually a holding pen is loud. Cattle are big animals. They shift their weight. They grunt. You can hear them chewing, a wet grinding noise that never really stops. Tonight the pen was dead silent. Wind whistled through the wire mesh of the fence. That was it. No grunts, no hooves dragging in the dirt. Something was wrong. Benny felt it in his gut, not a poetic feeling, just an instinct. Like knowing a belt is about to snap on a thresher before it happens. He unclipped the spotlight from his belt. It was a high-powered unit, solid plastic, battered from years of use. He clicked the switch. A beam of white light cut across the yard. It lit up the red and brown hides of the herd. Benny started his count again just to be sure. He tapped a finger against the wooden stock of his rifle. 1, 5, 12. He swept the light. Cows were standing up. They weren't sleeping, but they weren't moving either. They looked like taxidermy mounts bolted to the floor. 20. He stopped. Right in the middle of the herd, squeezed up against a big heifer, was that shape. At first glance, it looked like a calf. Sometimes a stray slips in through a gap in the wire. Benny adjusted the focus on his light. The beam tightened into a sharp circle. It wasn't a calf, it was a coyote. A big one. Benny stared. It didn't make sense. Coyotes are scavengers, sure, but they are also smart. They don't walk into a pen full of 1,000-pound animals unless they have a pack. And cows don't just stand there when a predator walks in. They panic. They stampede. A coyote smell usually sets them off like a firecracker. These cows were frozen. Their eyes reflected the spotlight, wide, glossy, staring straight ahead. They weren't looking at the coyote. They weren't looking at Benny. They looked sedated. That coyote stood there, tail tucked tight between its legs. It wasn't posturing. It wasn't growling. It looked mangy, fur missing in patches, gray skin showing through. Then it opened its mouth. Benny waited for a bark, but a low, resonant call rolled across the pen. It wasn't a bad imitation. It was perfect, deep, loud. It sounded more like a cow than the cows did. Benny watched the coyote's throat work, muscles bunched and released. A dog's throat shouldn't be able to make that noise. It was physically impossible. Yet there it was, a low, comforting call. It was a lullaby. That's the only way to describe it. A noise made to keep the meat calm. Benny lowered the light just a fraction. That heifer next to the coyote was sagging. Dark blood pooled around her hooves. It dripped into the dust with a wet, rhythmic tapping. That coyote had been eating her alive. And she was just standing there, hypnotized by that sound, letting it happen. Benny felt his temper flare. This was his livelihood. He worked too hard to let some freak animal tear up his stock. Fear took a backseat to anger. He brought the rifle up. A 30-30 lever action. Reliable. He tucked the stock against his shoulder and cheek. Wood felt cold against his skin. He lined up the iron sights. He put the bead right on the coyote's ribs. A shot there would punch through the lungs. Clean kill. He worked the lever. Metal locking into place cut through the quiet. The coyote's ear twitched. That was the first time it acknowledged Benny existed. Benny squeezed the trigger. Recoil kicked his shoulder. Muzzle flash blinded him for a split second. The report rolled out over the plains like a cannon shot. He saw the hit. A puff of dust and fur blew off the coyote's flank. The animal jerked. A 30-30 round hits with massive force. A coyote should have been thrown sideways. It should have been dead before it hit the ground. This one didn't fall. It didn't yelp. That mooing stopped. Silence rushed back in. Slowly, the creature turned its head. It didn't snap around. It rotated. Benny heard the joints grinding from 20 yards away. It sounded like dry kindling snapping in a fire. The head stopped. It looked right at him. Benny still had the spotlight on it. He saw the eyes. That was the part that made his hands sweat. They weren't dog eyes. Dog eyes shine in the light. These were flat, pale. They had whites. They were human eyes. It didn't look angry, it looked annoyed. It looked like a man who had been interrupted while reading a newspaper. Just a cold, flat stare of irritation. Benny tried to load another round. His hands were shaking now. He yanked the lever down. An empty brass casing flew out and hit the frozen dirt with a sharp ring. He tried to jam the lever back up, but he fumbled it. That creature didn't wait. It didn't run. It didn't charge. It just walked. It turned away from Benny and started walking through the herd. It moved with a stiff, jerky gait. Every step sounded wrong, like bones rubbing together without cartilage. It brushed past the cows. They didn't move. They stood like statues while this thing walked between them. It reached the back fence, 6 feet high, wire mesh. That creature didn't jump. It stepped over. Benny watched its legs stretch. It wasn't a trick of the light. Legs got longer, spindly and gross, lifting the body up and over the top rail. Wood of the fence groaned under the weight. Then it was gone, just swallowed up by the dark. Benny stood there. He held the rifle tight, knuckles white. 10 minutes passed. He timed it. For 10 minutes, the cows didn't move. That spell held even after the thing was gone. Finally, a cow blinked, then another one shifted its weight. The herd started to wake up, looking around, confused, lowing softly. Benny didn't go in there. He didn't check the wounded heifer. He turned around, walked back to his truck, and got in. He locked the doors. He drove back to the house, eyes glued to the rearview mirror. He locked the house up tight. Deadbolts, window latches. He sat in his chair with the rifle on his knees for the rest of the night. Benny knows cattle. He knows predators. He knows how the world works. But he knows one other thing now. Some things out there don't hunt with claws. They hunt by making you think everything is fine, right up until they start eating. And they have eyes that look a lot like yours.